Great, well, Assalamu alaikum everyone. Welcome aboard. I'm really happy that you decided to come out here tonight, and hopefully you're just as excited about this topic as we are and see it as a really important event. This is the second event in our Islam and Liberation series. The first one was 2 weeks ago with Professor Tariq Ramadan about liberation of the self. And now we're going to be talking about the environment. Just a date for your diaries, in 4 weeks' time, so November the 28th, or 29th I think actually, is our fourth event on Islam and liberation, which is going to be about Islam and decoloniality. The reason I mention that, of course, is because decoloniality is such an important concept, but also there have been attempts to put together the decolonize movement. So if you're interested in tonight's talk, then also 4 weeks' time, 4 weeks on Tuesday, will be Islam and decoloniality. So what is liberation in the Islamic context? Maybe two ways of looking at it. Liberation theology itself, when it first emerged, was very much an idea of focusing on the poor in South America and their response to the power systems that kind of oppressed them and exploited them. Reading theology through the eyes of the poor. Tariq Ramadan, however, gave us another conception of liberation theology a fortnight ago, which is focusing on the self and kind of finding within the means to overcome and decolonize and get away from the power structures that kind of try and oppress us. So whichever version of liberation theology you subscribe to, there's definitely a way of kind of linking this to the struggles that we face today, the struggles, structural racism, patriarchy, global capitalism, and climate change. And it's climate change that we're here to assess today. We're very lucky to have Hazim Azghari, a poet and an activist, who's got a very exciting talk lined up for us. But I think he won't mind me saying that the emphasis is really going to be on discussion, dialogue, opening up to the floor. We've got lots of different expertise in the room that I think we'll really benefit from. So Hazim's going to talk to us for around 45 minutes to an hour, but in a very interactive way, opening up to the floor for discussion, and then we'll take it from there. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Hazim, and let's start the event. Let's go.
Thank you. We're supposed to have a video screen in and talk about that, but the technology around that didn't work. But what we'll do is try to have this as interactive as possible. Obviously, feel free to interrupt at any given point in time. And if you feel, I kind of have some natural breakpoints in which I kind of try and look at everyone and see if there's any hands or question marks above your heads. And if that is the case, then we can probably cut it down and have a discussion. And if nothing comes up, I'll just continue and see where it goes from there. The point is probably just to take something from it rather than have a slur of content that doesn't really take us anywhere. Just like the environmental crisis in some sense. So, yeah, a rather uninspiring title for to talk, Islam and the environment. I kind of wanted to keep it as inclusive as possible so that, because Islam and climate change in some sense doesn't really fly with people who believe that global warming is a hoax, which actually among Muslims are revealed to be quite a few of them. And the environment sometimes is also called nature, but people tend to romanticize that nation of wilderness, nature and all of that. So we just wanted to keep it as broad as possible. So it is important to understand that when we talk of the environment, climate change is just an issue that is now being mainstream, but it's not the main. The crisis doesn't really sum up to that. The aquifers are running dry, the climate is changing. Yes, people died due to air pollution. That has nothing to do with climate change. The fish are choking on plastic that we're throwing in the ocean, and every day dozens of species are going extinct. And the sprawl of cities combined with commercial agriculture and cattle farming in some sense is deforesting every bit of rainforest left on the planet. Ecosystems are also being disrupted, and finally the whole climate system is responding violently through more instances of extreme weather storms, hurricanes, sea level rise threatening the very fabric of our society. Because indeed, why would someone care if that wasn't the ultimate risk? In the case of climate change at least, the issue is really about the issue of climate change is actually becoming central just because society as we know it is not guaranteed to last. It's not because of some religious reason, at least as far as international discourse is concerned. So from a faith point of view, the question to ask is, are people of God or people of the divine to be concerned about such issues? Most religions, if not all of them, have a component of environmental ethics, we are told, and the recent climate outreach report on the 5 faiths and climate change states that, quote, for all faiths, caring for the natural world is a principle strongly embedded in text and observance. And it also says, quote, the principle of the world being a gift that we have a responsibility to respect appears spontaneously in people's language across faiths. End quote. Islam is certainly a religion that has received a lot of attention regarding this issue, some calling it the green deen loosely translated as religion, and the Quran calls human beings vicegerents of God on earth, responsible for taking care of it and cultivating it and protecting the divine trust. But when we are asked what should Muslims do in the face of climate change, we might find ourselves rolling our eyes wondering why should Muslims be asked about everything, or thus as made responsible about everything, or engaging in some sort of discourse of, oh, the Quran talks about this, or in other cases denying the whole thing, calling it a hoax engineered by the West. Now, within a liberation theology perspective, we certainly can read the environmental crisis in terms of oppression and injustice, perpetrated by European man on countries that were resource-rich but lacking in military might at the time of the so-called discoveries, or great discoveries. European man has in some sense robbed poor countries, which in many ways were functioning under some faith, and has indeed enabled the Industrial Revolution and still powers the modern display of civilization as we know it. So why would a country as small as Belgium, with no natural resources whatsoever, have a cup of coffee cost something like €5, for example? Well, if you look back at the riches that King Leopold III stole from the Congo, you can start to get somewhat of an answer to this question. But before talking about how helpful an environmental liberation theology can be within an Islamic perspective, it is worth mentioning that we're not proposing something new. Gandhi attempted something similar at the time of British occupation. Gandhi did not envision the future of India in imitating British industrialization. In fact, he saw it in reviving the cottage industries, the traditional crafts, and images of Gandhi spinning his own cloth have indeed permeated the world and inspired many movements that advocate simple living as a way of finding spiritual solace, for example. But in doing so, Gandhi was not only proposing an environmentally friendly development course for India, he was also doing some sort of nonviolent resistance, ahimsa, kind of strangling the British textile industry by valuing the yarn and stopping its export into Great Britain for basically nothing. So, why such readings may actually be satisfying, I argue that they're not necessarily helpful or advisable, for that matter, within an Islamic perspective. Apart from the fact that standing against countries that were historically known as oppressors of nature and the environment is an angry realization, and anger is considered by Islam to be a disease of the heart, doing so is also a very shallow endeavor. And a recent example of that, related to climate change, is a clause within the Paris Agreement of last year in the United Nations Climate Change Conference, commonly known as loss and damage. So loss and damage is basically a mechanism under which developing countries are asking so-called historically responsible countries, aka countries that started emitting carbon dioxide since the Industrial Revolution, Great Britain being one of them, to pay or compensate countries that just started developing and thus so emitting carbon dioxide a few decades ago. So what this suggestion has certainly not been popular among developed countries. We already have a whole slur of climate justice activists advocating for a whole power game, illustrating basically climate change as an issue of oppression, oppressors being states, developed states on developing states, governments on their own citizens, and to some extent even male fishermen on female housewives. So the whole thing has been framed in a very interesting kind of gender perspective, kind of a Foucaultian power paradigm in some sense. But before going too deeply into that, loss and damage in some sense, as to my opinion, is somewhat of a blame game. Developing countries are asking for funds to enable basically the same course of development that of the countries they're blaming, which created the problem in the first place in some sense. So just as one of the fighters of the Islamic State has shouted, if Turkey cuts our water supply, we will conquer Istanbul, loss and damage does ring thoughts of an angry environmental liberation, minus a few heretic beliefs. Hence, addressing the environmental crisis cannot really proceed by dealing with the symptoms, but it has to deal with the root causes. So then the natural question to ask is, what is the root cause of the environmental crisis from an Islamic point of view? One would go back to the conventional definition of economics, the allocation of scarce resources to satisfy unlimited wants. Kenneth Bolden, himself an economist, rightly said that anyone who believes exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. But today, nearly everybody thinks like that. Growth is an unquestionable assumption. Less than 3% of GDP growth gives shivers to everyone, ringing thoughts of recession and loss of jobs, unemployment, etc. But the Prophet Muhammad confirms that the unlimited nature of human wants is indeed a problem. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, had the son of Adam been given a mound of gold, he would equally want another. Put simply, from an Islamic perspective, the environmental crisis is a result of seeking the infinite within the finite. But if blaming the oppressors is a shallow endeavor, I think blaming the environmental crisis on growth and progress only is probably also shallow. But not quite, because the development of civilization as we know it is not the mere result of a quantitative jump in scientific innovations and publications and books and all of that in the wake of the scientific and industrial revolutions. What happened was a deep change in the perception of human beings in the universe, from stewards, basically, to masters over nature in Descartes' terms. So this shift does not just happen because the circumstances were there. Guns, germs, and steel were also there in China, but didn't lead to the Industrial Revolution. So the seemingly continuous history of mankind, namely that we progressed linearly from hunter-gatherers to settled agriculture to urban centers, is quite superficial. European man, capital M, captured the earth in many aspects, and the amassing of wealth gave him a sense of independence from heaven. The need to satisfy the honest elements of the human soul were replaced by material requirements for comfort. And the quest for paradise on earth basically started. And paradise lies somewhere in the future, either through a series of 5-year plans on the communist side, or a continuous growth of GDP on the capitalist side of the world. Also, this movement was not just backed by so-called practical things such as the amassing of wealth, but also from an intellectual point of view, it was backed by many philosophies. The rise of Galileo's materialism, Descartes' mastery over nature, Darwin's survival of the fittest, Hegelian dialectic, Nietzsche's Superman concept, and socialist utopias were among a few kind of intellectual backbones that pushed this forward. And this development in some sense forsook heaven and opened up a new earth for unrestricted exploitation, because why would you restrict yourself? And traditional societies actually never thought that one had the freedom, or for that matter, the permission to do whatever one wanted with the natural world. It was very much a sacred realm that you couldn't touch without permission of so-called gods or deities at the time. And we have examples throughout history in people who starved to death, basically, and did not touch the forest up there on the hill, because that is the sacred forest. Another example that people can ask themselves is probably a cheeky one, but why are there free cows roaming in India when people are dying out of hunger? And that just tells you that the sacredness is a little bit more than just, there's no determinist aspect to this is food, therefore I shall eat. In some sense, the kindness of nature as well enabled people to forget about the drudgery of making a living. So in some sense, when you have a lot of water and a lot of resources, and you basically unlock this resource called coal, and you start doing a lot of things, you can forget about such thing called famine and diseases until they really come back. And when you hit a new natural boundary, such as climate change in our case, can we keep doing the same things within a world that is 4 degrees warmer? Probably not. And that's when we start thinking. Otherwise, nobody ever thought this way of doing things would ever face any difficulties. The communists believed that pollution was the result of capitalism, but during the time of the USSR, the Volga River in Russia was one of the most polluted rivers in the world. Others thought and still think of it as an externality that needs to be internalized and thus can be fixed by fining X company an amount of $1 million to fix their waste problem. But until the 1960s, the idea of planetary boundaries, of that the world had some natural limits to it, just was not there. But now that we know it, the solution does not reside, according to my argument, in applying more technology in a wiser way to stay within the so-called planetary boundaries. While the current state of thought tells us that the crisis is a transient phase and sustainable development programs will make us avoid the disasters which the misapplication of modern science has brought upon the environment, Islam tells us that humanity cannot go on happily on forever in the state of forgetfulness of God. So the real price to pay to live at peace with nature is to be mindful of God's creation and experience a change from within. Because the more empty one becomes inwardly, the more one is satisfied only with what is external. The Islamic tradition confirms that the environmental crisis is nothing but an external manifestation of a deep inward disease. The Quran instructs us, corruption has appeared throughout the land and sea by the reason of what the hands of people have earned, so that He, God, may let them taste part of the consequences of what they have done, perhaps so they will return to righteousness or to God. Corruption, fasad, original Arabic, traditionally also means pollution. And here it is clearly marked as a sign for people to return or refrain from doing evil, corrupting the earth, pollution, and back to God. But differently from environmentalists, Islam does not consider humans as part of the whole, but rather as occupying a special position within the world. And unlike deep ecologists or other environmental thinkers, Islam certainly does not consider nature as sacred. The Faith and Climate Change Report also mentions that, especially among Muslims, the idea of natural limits is not actually accepted. It's not really accepted. Muslims see no limit to divine provision, and it is better to talk about the need to limit human desires for moral reasons. Islam also departs from sustainable development in that humans are not here to make nature or resources subservient to their needs. Nature has already been made subservient by God, and the aim is not to use it by controlling it, but rather to use it by managing it for devotional purposes, i.e. to attain heaven. Modern technology, be it sustainable or not, is not just a neutral tool from a religious point of view. Technology theorists like Ibn Illich in the 1970s made a distinction between tools and machines, technologies that are alienating and technologies that are liberating. Modern technology not only alienates us from the real world by distancing us from everything natural, but it also makes us oblivious to the real limits of nature that we would have been acquainted with traditionally had we lived in traditional societies. In some sense, if you're cutting down a forest tree by tree, you'll realize when you're getting near to the end of it. But when you're buying tables made of sustainable wood in the supermarket, you never really know when the forest is coming to an end shortly. So in some sense, there's a mechanized worldview also that participated to that. And the idea that God has kind of wind up the world with some physical laws and kind of let it run, added to the fact that the human spirit is kind of being externalized because of this deep inward emptiness that we feel, it's kind of making the idea of staying in touch with God, which would necessarily make us take care of the environment as an artifact, a difficult matter. People who are in touch with the environment can sit and wait for 2 hours, and if you go to the countryside, you probably would see that. While if one of us were to do that, you probably need an iPad, a magazine, chewing gum, a radio, earphones, just to keep yourself from going mad. In conclusion, we got to a place in which it's really difficult to make any decision. While modern medicine is a bliss, it has given us the population problem, and while everybody talks about making technologies sustainable, greener, or reducing carbon emissions, nobody wants to talk about reducing people, because that's very controversial. And while the abolition of modern civilization is nowhere to be heard, on the other side, the abolition of man, transhumanism, or the idea that we can become robots, basically, not fettered by our natural limits anymore, is the new vogue. So, in some sense, I will conclude it by saying that if we're to preserve society as we know it, we don't need to stay human. But, if there is a future, it's open to creativity as long as two things are kept in check. First, we cannot go on as we have been doing. And two, we have to come up with a solution that emanates from a reformed human understanding of our relationship to the natural environment first, our position within the universe, and third, our mission on Earth as stewards. And I will conclude here and open it for questions. Thank you. Question?
Okay, so any thoughts about what we've heard so far?
It doesn't have to be a question, it can be a comment. Right?
Thank you for your talk. You mentioned that unlike deep ecology, Muslims don't believe that there is a sacredness to nature. How would you compare that to whether or not nature has an intrinsic value, apart from viewing nature as something being just for human benefit versus having general purposes outside of human benefit in terms of ecosystems and their relationships of communities within one another and their interaction, as opposed to just for anthropocentric purposes?
A very difficult question to answer, but as far as I understand, nature is not sacred in itself, because I guess Islam is a brutal memory of paganism, but nature, as far as it is a reflection of the sacredness of God, is in that sense intrinsically valued. But that is probably a question that you'll be able to answer easier if you think about, let's say, the leopard, snow leopard, a species on the verge of extinction. Is the snow leopard a intrinsically kind of valuable species? If it does go away, does it make us sad? Yes, but in the greater scheme of things, was that not something that was going to happen anyway? And that kind of starts to make you think of the ideas of Islam and the world being a fleeting reality, and thus nothing being worth preserving. Yet, you cannot, basically, if you're on a roller coaster, even though you're going downhill, you cannot really decide that because that is happening, it's not worth kind of telling your friend to keep sure your hat doesn't fly off, because that's just against corrupting the human soul. So in some sense, I'm not trying to answer your question, but nature is intrinsically valued, yes, but as long as it's managed for devotional purposes, whatever happens to it is basically in the realm of God, because humans cannot really function in the realm of cause and consequence. That is really just God doing things, and it could be a calamity as much as it is a tribulation, not necessarily caused by humans, but at least your intentions should be clean in that sense. No.
Okay, keep it. Great. Any more questions? That's a brilliant question. Any more?
I was interested in what you were saying about climate change as an external manifestation of some sort of societal corruption, and how corruption is linked to pollution. I was wondering if you could just kind of elaborate on that a little bit more, and I felt like it was particularly germane to some of the comments we've had about the kind of capitalist or the emphasis on exponential growth. And I don't know if the sort of the link you were making between a kind of environmental corruption and kind of economic excess is something that comes up in a religious discourse more, or if that was an extrapolation.
I think that is certainly not, in that sense, what I'm confident in saying is that Quran points out the fact that unlimited wants of humans would definitely bring about forgetfulness of God, and therefore a sense of not punishment but more of a warning that will definitely make you realize that there's the only thing worth keeping in mind is God and not of heaven on earth. But whether that unlimited wants of human desires is modern economics as we know it, that is just a personal effort to kind of make the analogy there, because to me it's quite strong and quite obviously clear that if you say we're trying to get to a better state and we keep doing that forever, then obviously what you're asking for is an infinite state of goodness, and as loosely defined as heaven in religious terms, I guess. But I don't know if that answers your question.
And it goes back to the idea of maybe a way of Islamic thinking, which is what you said about how this world is fleeting anyway, and so should we really be concerned with climate change? And I think it's arguable that from an Islamic perspective, what's actually problematic about climate change is more so the reasons why we have it now and the way in which it is used. Because if you look, for example, at the economic perspective of climate change, which is just an allocation of limited resources, or for example, if we look at how the IMF, as one of its conditions when a country from Africa wants to borrow something, one of its conditions is to
follow certain regulations.
Yes, and arguably that is just a tool of certain Western countries to impose limits on the development of countries and so on. So I think the way that climate change can be seen is as a very political and economic tool, and I think, well, I would argue at least that that is where Islam would find climate change problematic, And we try to change that thinking from a more economic and political treatment of nature and the environment to a more ethical and directing these resources to doing good as opposed to just fulfilling our unlimited desires. And I guess my question would be, do you think this is reversible, or is it too late, basically?
Wow. Well, I don't think I'm an environmental scientist in that matter, but what I can say is that, again, it depends on what you're fixated on in some sense. If you're fixated on having modern AC or Wi-Fi, then probably things are a bit, within 10 years it will be too late. But if you're concerned about preserving the human nature of being a stewardship on Earth, be it whether you live in a mud brick building or in a skyscraper, then probably we can still do a lot of things. And if you're willing to tackle questions of basically, if you're willing to tackle the real ethical questions of the modern age that none of the Islamic traditional scholars have thought about, such as transhumanism and human cloning and all of these, then we can probably arrive to some sort of understanding, because these things down the line will probably be the only solutions put on the table if you want to, again, get fixated on society as we know it. But in some sense, it is also reversible if we decide that other political and economic tools are no longer relevant. So the concept of a nation state is deeply problematic when it comes to natural resources. Take two countries next to each other, if one pollutes the atmosphere and one doesn't, it doesn't really matter, because at the end of the day, that's why climate change is an international issue. It's because CO2 is what they call a well-mixed pollutant. It means that if anywhere it is emitted within the next decade, it will be everywhere, and everyone suffers the consequences of that. Things such as water pollution were never an international discourse, because if you polluted a river, the only country that would complain would be the one downstream, and most cases that country would be poor anyway and it couldn't do anything about it. I think Turkey and Iraq and other places. So, I don't know. Probably if we experience a deep change from within, to realize that our position here is not to conquer nature, but basically to conquer ourselves, our inner demons, then we could probably reverse this. I'm being kind of an optimist. Yes.
Do you mean to say that it's a spiritual problem?
In short, yes.
So how do you convince people who are not really spiritual and would rather go and indulge in activities like music or anything? How do you go back from there and get them thinking about a spiritual problem?
Well, there's two things here. First, I don't think this is an issue of raising awareness, just because, well, first, we're in Oxford, and second, I think that society always takes course with the thinking mind. Who would have thought that someone like, you go ask someone out there in the street about something and they'll tell you, oh, that's what you think, that's what I think. And a position like, relativism is not something that was there since the birth of human history. It's probably as old as 100 years. And now everybody thinks about it as their own idea, relativism, in terms of moral relativism. The same things that are being discussed here in this room probably will permeate society down the line, or not. So to me, it's not really an issue of raising awareness, but more guiding society through some key ideas that will permeate it. And second, I think when it comes to this idea of spirituality, you think about it, you can sit down, talk with a friend for 3 hours, or probably go to the movie theater and watch a movie for 2 hours and not feel anything, as in stressful, but to force yourself to think about nothing for 30 seconds, it probably makes you suffer. And in that sense, to me, that's just a symptom that when you tell people, can you do that, and they can't, they just realize that there's something missing to their whole kind of aspect of being human. Because we're not just external beings in that sense, I guess. But I don't know, that's the real answer.
So my question is, what do you think is kind of the relationship between kind of the intentions and just kind of going into the spirituality and just thinking about the environment and thinking about yourself and making some small changes to yourself and improve spiritually, and also just the global impact of environment and how that could kind of lead to further suffering and
Do you want to answer that?
Well, I mean, that's a really good question, because that is the big dialectic at the heart of liberation theology, which is, and I'm going to throw this back at you in a second, so be prepared, which is we haven't necessarily been able to solve the key issue, which is, yes, we should liberate the self, and we should decolonize the heart, and all these kind of things. Yes, liberate the self. But in order to make the changes that are necessary to save the planet, and also, liberate great classes of people that are currently being crushed under the weight of capitalism and imperialism, we're going to need structural change. I mean, there's a famous quote, J.P. Morgan doesn't care if you grow your own chickens. It doesn't affect him, the company, in any way. What's needed is structural change. So, Tariq Ramadan talked a little bit about this, about how we should, yes, focus on the self at first to get our intentions right, but then join in kind of activism and join in kind of other movements that are kind of fighting for change. So is it the case, come back to Hazim, that we should actually, Muslims should be at the forefront of climate activism?
I guess here's the thing. If you compare that to modern, 20th century, the bloodiest century of all, colonialism, in some sense, I don't know, I can think of my own country again, Morocco, and how at some point, I mean, Moroccans were overpowered by military might and all of that, and modern readings of history just say that, France after World War II basically felt weak, and Moroccans seized the opportunity to write this document and started killing random soldiers everywhere, and then finally the French retreated. While the other reading of history written by Moroccans say that there's this Moroccan traditional scholar who wrote this prayer called Prayer of the Oppressed, and he was being sang everywhere in the country for like 2 years, and next thing you know is we got independence. So to me, why not both in some sense? And if you're thinking in that sense, as a human being, the most dangerous thing we face today is what I call spiritual candy. This idea that you can basically put headphones on your head, listen to meditation music, and solve the problems of the world by basically, overflowing with positive energy. And this whole, you know what I'm talking about. So New Age philosophies are very interesting because in some sense they're giving you that, okay, you can basically solve the problem of slavery by compulsory. That's literally what they're telling you. Or you can end World War II by singing a prayer on your own. But the thing is, when everybody does that at the same time, that kind of also raises some kind of thoughts as to, should I do this practical action, yes or no? And it's the whole kind of balance between individualism and kind of community. And if that makes any sense, I guess it's being together while realizing that at the end of the day, everyone has a one-on-one relationship with the divine. So in a funny kind of pun, you are together alone. And in some sense, the intentions and the actions both matter.
You made a point there about progress and how progress is often linked with industrialization, and therefore, Muslim countries that wanted to progress had to industrialize to a certain extent.
Yes.
And this is not so much a question, but it's an interesting anecdote which sort of really, shout out from Dr. Talal, which sort of illustrates that very nicely, which is, if you go back to the 19th century in Syria, when much of the land, as in many Muslim countries, was owned by waqfs, by religious trusts that used them for various purposes. There's an example of often those waqfs are thought to have held back progress because the land wasn't being used for, it wasn't on the free market, it wasn't being traded, it wasn't being used productively. Yeah, exactly. So there's an example of a big land of waqf in Damascus that was taken by the ruler, and then turned into an industrial fair in the 19th century. And obviously, there was a massive industrial fair, and this was seen as a sign of progress. This land that was being wasted beforehand was now being used to promote industry. Now, the original purpose of that land was for old horses and dogs who had nowhere else to go, just go there and graze until they die, basically, and old people's home for horses. So now 2 centuries on, when environmentalism is much more of an issue, our concept of what progress actually is has sort of flipped now. Closing down an industrial fair and opening up a place for old animals is seen as progressive now. So
But in some sense, it's also very much because the West is doing it, and it's very funny now because if you think about it, you get people now doing these kind of, like in the Muslim world, very quick to do this in Morocco at least. Recycling is a new fad because it's been done in San Francisco, not because it's Islamically rooted in some kind of ethic. And that is itself just telling you how much of we're still in that rhetoric, or we're being overpowered by this scheme. So let's follow it step by step. You know, industrialize, kind of wake up, meditate, and then recycle. And that's literally what we're doing. And to some extent, to me, if we don't realize that at some point it's good to be different, and it's not in some sense putting us, you know, in some kind of position of being lower than other countries, especially Western countries, because the Muslim world loves to call the West, you know, blame on everything, then it's literally, that's it, that's the solution. I mean, a very interesting story is how when the State of Israel was being set up in 1948, a lot of, again, Moroccan Jews fled under some sort of kind of story that there will be an anti-Semitic feeling and people will kill you and all of that, so you better flee the country. Among a lot of those were North African Berbers, North African Jews or Berber Jews that were in Morocco, you know, craftsmen and all of this, and people who did traditional, basically, arts and crafts. And the moment they went to Israel, there was a creation of certain kind of a social class between the Ashkenazi, Sephardi, and other Jews because of their jobs. So when you were a craftsman, even though you produced amazing kind of crafts, I mean, they're still standing, you were a bit lower than the ones who were traditionally accountants and all of that. So it's that perception of being lower than the other is really at the heart of the issue. But sometimes you can't really choose because, again, society might put a toll on you and tell you to go to, you know, build the kibbutz and all of that because you're the one who been a son of a bricklayer, so you can only be that, which takes us back to other societies and how there was no idea of social mobility. And kind of Islam came to abolish that, but then it kind of started recreating it because to promote its own power. I don't know. Then, to be honest, it's just to me a very funny artifact that whatever comes our way, good or bad, we'll just do it. As in, when say we as a Muslim world. Probably there's no such thing as a Muslim world as well. An idea
Do you think there's a vocabulary or a way of speaking which would enable you, for example, to share Muslim ideas, Islamic ideas of spirituality relating to climate change and human desire in particular with a multi-faith and secular society?
So you're asking for which way of doing it?
I mean, I wonder, you're using terms relating to Islam, to religion, but if things that everybody needs to talk about, the problem, you see it, the problem not the technologies you're using, but human desire, if I understand you correctly. And that's an important idea, obviously, to share and discuss. People from other faiths wouldn't necessarily use the same vocabulary. Certainly people who see themselves as secular, and I think in British society and a whole range of people. Is there a way of sharing your ideas?
I would see definitely a way of doing that, because as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to this idea of limiting human desires, it really is a thing that works across all languages. And it's when somebody is being covetous or greedy, it doesn't need to go in any language for you to understand exactly what's happening. And whether that is going to be dealt with through some sort of a prayer to the direction of Mecca or just some inward meditation doesn't actually matter in the grand scheme of things as long as the issue is being recognized. So to me, I think the heart of the interfaith issue is really to agree on the problem and then probably to be creative on the way we deal with it. It doesn't necessarily have to be the same solution or like a full agreement across all stages of the problem. But as long as we recognize human desire is the problem, that is already like a big step. And I think that's as much vocabulary as we need, and we probably need more action after that.
But I mean, I just wonder if it happens if people stay in their own little boxes and continue to use their own way of describing things. Actually, there's a lot of room for agreement and a lot of room for learning. And
Well, I was quite positively surprised when I read the climate report on the 5 fates and climate change, and basically what they came up with was, again, because they want to give these things to policymakers, and it's a one-page summary that says language that works across all faiths, language that doesn't work across all faiths. So when you talk of justice, most faiths don't like this. When you talk about fairness, probably something that does work. So in some sense, they came up with 5 words, being fairness, the other one was cultivation, balance, and I forgot the last 2. But they said that these 5 are the things that people should be using in the language so as to get the most echo within those faith communities. And you can find it, it's the Climate Outreach Report on 5 faiths and climate change. And I think it's getting somewhere. And the fact that it's being used to get someone in the United Nations to draft a policy is probably a sad conclusion, but it's getting somewhere, I feel.
great, thanks.
I'm sorry, but I got the impression that we have to be passive and we have to accept the fact that we are going to die and we don't have to do anything about it. Though, according to what I know, it's like in Islam, we have to really take care, like environment is a very important thing. We have to protect it. It's like when you were doing your wudu, even next to the river, you do not have to waste water. Even if you know that the other day is going to be Judgment Day, you have to plant the tree. So, I don't know, it's like I got the impression that it's like we just have to, spirituality, okay, it's important, we all know this, but it's not gonna solve the problem. We have to act.
I totally agree.
Yeah, but it's like, I don't know, I had the impression like we have to all end up to be like just, spirituality will not solve the problem.
Well, here's the thing, I guess the real problem, we don't disagree at heart, but we probably define spirituality as slightly different things. If spirituality is, again, this personal solution of just close your eyes and meditate without having any kind of action beyond the door of your room, then yes, to me that is not, that is not spirituality. Obviously that is not effective. Spirituality is in very much this idea that you go out there and do things. Because there is a certain also spirituality of work. If you look at like how modern craftsmen used to build a house, and at least in Muslim countries that I know in North Africa, with every brick they would say, La ilaha illallah, or there is no God but Allah. So that's spirituality at work, and that is not something we don't consider as being part of action, right? So in some sense I totally agree, it's just that spirituality is probably a bigger umbrella term that we think,
Okay.
and that kind of results in the dilemma.
Okay. So I read an article recently by Bill McKibben, he's founder of 350.org, and he said that one of the most common questions that he gets is, what can I do?
Yeah.
And he actually said, throughout the article, at the end, he said, the real question should be, what can we do? Because individually, you can change your lights and recycle and all of that, but unless you join a movement, nothing is going to happen. And so my question is, why are we not seeing a grassroots movement and Muslims being at the forefront of the climate change movement, like in the West? I know it's more of a complicated question, but in terms of Muslim majority countries, what do you think is the biggest factor that's not leading to this, widespread awareness and mobilization, that where the people are actually empowered to do something and to lobby to create change at a higher level?
I think it's quite simply one word, it's envy. And it's just, why would we, when this is a mistake you made, in the West, and we want to be in your position, and then we'll think about the problems, but let us get there first. And it's you guys with the big airplanes and all of that telling us to reduce our pollution, like, look at yourselves kind of thing, and we're not going to do much about it. It's very much this dialectical problem. It's not really an idea of looking at yourself in the mirror, it's like, I could be better. It's more like, look at who's telling me this. But if you look at indigenous communities, actually a lot of grassroots movements within the indigenous communities, and some of them are actually indigenous Muslim communities as well, and those people, because they have a certain kind of relationship to the land and to the resources, they're very much at the forefront of action. The problem is that nobody hears what they have to say, and obviously there is no money to fund those people because there's no vested interest at all, apart from protecting some patch of the Amazon forest, if they do indeed say that we'll live there, but if they don't, then nobody cares again. But when it comes to Muslim majority countries, I mean, just the fact that on a Friday prayer, you cannot get on the pulpit and speak about the environment framed as progress, going, bad, going basically on progress on steroids or that kind of stuff. Because the moment you do that, you're saying that we should not develop, and the state discourse will just get you out of your position. You can always say, you can save water while doing your ablutions, you can plant a tree and all of that, everything's nice, but the moment you get structural and talk about the state is polluting the rivers, then you go bust. And that's the line that religion is not allowed to cross in some sense, because no, we can't afford not to develop, we have to, because poverty, because disease, because next country is going to bomb us anytime, that kind of dialectic. So I think I see, that's probably a personal suggestion, but to localize movements, to have every city have their own kind of realization of their immediate environment, is probably going to do something about it, because that turns you into somewhat of an indigenous community. But someone in Casablanca cannot really care about what's happening in, somewhere in Libya, because although that's where some resources come from, you never see it, you don't even know. So.
Are there any ecological movements in Islamic societies, environmental movements, Islamic countries?
There are a few, and as far as I'm concerned, most of them are in North America and Canada, and some others are in, there's always a few associations here and there. In Europe as well, there's the International Foundation for Islamic Ecology, if I remember it, somewhere in California as well.
What they are doing, what kind of activities?
They're planting a lot of trees, they are doing awareness, they are telling people to save water. It's basically, again, nobody's really calling for any sort of structural action, and that is probably because they don't want to have the police at their door as well. But I think the best movement so far that I've seen, and I'm not 100% sure whether it is in Mexico, but there was this kind of Muslim kind of county that started to basically, it's a rural kind of village. And they started promoting, instead of saying we should migrate to the city because we're running out of jobs and everything, we should improve our environment to create jobs and stay here. And they started kind of the whole idea of the eco-village. And that is, as far as I'm concerned, probably one of the best ideas you could do, because again, instead of progress into the city, the natural kind of end point of everyone.
Active?
I think it is.
So tourists are going to that to visit that?
Nobody's going there because it's seen as some kind of, again, some like radicalized group, whatever, doing some kind of farming and carrying weapons to kill anyone who touches their fields. But it's probably very different from that. And the fact that people decide to stay in the countryside, even though there's a recession in the country, it just tells you they're probably good intentions in some sense. So that's as far as I know.
Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier, like, the Islamic world sort of copying the Western world, like cycling in Morocco, for example. But do you think there's an issue of the Islamic world, in this sense, of opposing a Western idea? The opposite, I guess.
About the Islamic world opposing?
Not sort of opposing it, but since it's the West is on the forefront of trying to tackle it, the Islamic world is just not really engaging with it.
In some sense, it is proportional to your responsibility. The degree to which you care. Because obviously the environmentalist movement rose in the 60s in communes in the United States, and proportionally that is the country that has wreaked the most havoc in some sense. So why would a country such as, again, Morocco, who counts for like 2% of world carbon dioxide emissions, care about their impact? Or even slash 100% of it and not make a single dent in what's happening globally? In some sense, it is also, if we go with that idea of just being resistant the idea of like, okay, they're doing this, we're not going to do it, then again, it's probably just still the same problem. What we need is kind of just, not a deglobalization, but in some sense, yes, of ideas. Stop importing and rejecting what you read on The Guardian or any other outlet for that matter, but start forming your own ideas. And then if it happens that it confirms with some stuff that is out there, then yes. But if it doesn't, it doesn't. It doesn't really have to, match the international discourse on what is happening and But again, it's because if you're going to look at these countries, most of their projects are funded by the United Nations, World Bank, IMF, the Green Climate Fund, and if you want to convince those people, you have to basically advertise yourself within their vocabulary. Oh, we're doing, if you want to get a grant from the EU, you need to talk about youth employment. If you want to get a grant from the World Bank, you're going to have to talk about free trade. If you want to get a grant from the Green Climate Fund, you need to talk about how raising fish is going to sequester carbon, although it's a very far-fetched idea. So, again, the money game is there, and it kind of keeps pushing forward this idea that you have to just follow course of the ideas. You can't really develop your own ideas. But I guess in some sense, the moment you reduce your dependence both on ideas and on resources and other things, and accept some kind of lower standards of life, quality and all that, probably that's where you can branch out and start digging your own path. And from there it gets to some comfort zone within 10, 20, 30 years. But it will definitely have to go through sacrifice and a period of struggle. It's not going to be easy. And I guess that's the heart of the issue. Do you stay here comfortably, or do you dig your own path, kind of not really knowing where you're going to end up, but as long as you're motivated by the right intentions? And probably that's the way we should go. I mean, everyone, not just the Islamic.
You may choose not to answer this if you don't want to. The way I interpret what you are saying is, and also related to the last question, is I think you agree that this climate change, sustainable development, it's just a new developmental discourse to a new form of modern colonialism on developing world. And you are coming from Morocco, being an environmental activist. Don't you think that if you are participating in that kind of movement, even though you have the right intention, but in the big scheme of things, you are just supporting something that's going to lead to what Islam don't want to be?
I didn't really get the last bit.
Like modernization, keep developing.
Well, how are you promoting that if you speak against these
I don't
things
know.
being a modern scheme?
Sorry?
It's also asking, I guess, like, if aren't you part of this tendency to kind of prevent the Islamic world from modernizing? Like the green kind of talk is just a tool to kind of stop the world from developing, and you're being kind of maybe suggested that you're kind of without your intention kind of playing along with that and kind of.
Well, I guess you're right. I mean, if I stand up tomorrow and say Morocco should go back and everyone shouldn't be a craftsmanship, I'll probably be shot down. But the point is that because that's the only idea that we have in mind right now is going back in time, and that's probably not the right way to go anyway, we should kind of start accepting that the future might look different from how it looks in what we're aiming for, like, you know, skyscrapers, nice roads, you know, conquering land from the sea and building cities on top of it. It might look different, and it's not necessarily going to be a technological fantasy of some sort of like cities built on their solar farms. It might end up being some kind of, you know, creative descent to living back in simple villages with a population density that is very low, and we might get back diseases that we'll just have to deal with in simple ways because vaccines won't exist anymore. It might be radical, but the fact that we're just open to discussing alternatives is really what I'm asking for, because the moment you stop idealizing or idolizing this quest for progress is really the moment you start freeing yourself from the shackles of modernization, and then you can talk about, I mean, whether you want to build skyscrapers in mud bricks or whether you want to, you know, recycle skyscrapers and build roads out of them or something else. But it's really about just killing the only solution we have there, opening up the floor for a discussion about everything else. Whatever it is, I mean, then let the best kind of win. But if we don't do that, what is for sure going to happen is we're just going to keep following on the same mistakes, end up doing the same thing, and I mean, get caught on this dialectic as well of being us and them, which is at the heart of the problem as well. We don't want to do that. We want to kind of join efforts and imagine a new kind of planet in which not everybody has to be the same, one, and two, you know, there are different ways of qualifying what is happiness. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that your GDP is growing every year, or that your income, or GDP per capita, or your income is this much. it might be just the fact that you're happy doing what you're doing versus somewhere else being, at least if you're not happy with your conditions, happy kind of to lead them the way you think they should. It's kind of the happiness in motion or happiness in being static. But apart from that, if we don't do any of this, we're just, I mean, how could you expect a different result? That's really the question. As in a solution.
You truly believe that?
Well, I do. Well, I beg to be an optimist. It's kind of difficult. I guess, yeah, every year things get tougher. And yes.
So what would you see as a more realistic solution? Because obviously on an individual basis, you can kind of harness your spirituality and change the way you see the world in terms of like materialism versus like just your sort of general like that spirituality. But for the wider world, like obviously most people don't see it like that. They wouldn't think about it, or even if they do, they choose to ignore it. So would you think a more realistic solution would be, if that is still what they're driven towards going for, then do it in a more sustainable way rather than not doing it at all, which is kind of like what you're suggesting more of. So do you see that there is the possibility for, obviously there are all these kind of green technologies, and the problem is that it's expensive and it's not something that countries want to do when they've got the alternative for sort of polluting, which is a lot cheaper and a lot better for their development. But do you see that there is any future where we can be sustainable and can be green and function in a society that is genuinely renewable and not sort of air polluting?
No, I totally agree. In fact, I may not have made it clear, but if we are to be realist and pragmatically speaking, what will happen is that we need these kind of technologies, wind, solar, all of this, to get us to a place in which we can actually think about the actual crisis, because it will still be happening. So, in some sense, covering the whole planet in solar farms doesn't solve the problem, but it doesn't mean we can do without it. Because right now, if we don't do anything, we're bust. So in some sense, we have to do that only to be able to give ourselves a position from within which you can think about the actual problem. Because the problem doesn't end with carbon dioxide. The moment climate change finishes, we have deforestation. The moment deforestation finishes, we have species extinction. The moment that happens, we have something else. And before you know it, I don't know, if you just, green technologies are not necessarily also something totally sustainable. I mean, if you look at the drawbacks, these naysayers of like solar farms and wind farms and all of that, there's a lot of bad things to them as well. And if you decide to upscale that to a planetary level, you might find yourself doing the same kind of stuff and then talking about how we should bring back fossil fuels, because back at the time it was such a great thing. And but you can't do without it. I guess we're talking in a kind of an intellectual level. If you want to make decisions, you basically would have to promote renewables, become some kind of big thinker, and propose a solution 10 years down the line that will then be accepted as the major way of doing things. And in that sense, we have to be visionaries and anticipate it before it even kind of comes up. Because right now, nobody talks about the post-renewable. And that is for sure going to come. It's not too far-fetched if you think about it. The moment people start running on batteries, and we have people that kind of implant parts within them, it's a whole other discourse. So in some sense, yes, we should, but we should think about what comes after that as well. Yeah.
Sorry, hi. Last question. I was interested in what you're talking about, like kind of the climate change, no snow borders, and like the nation state actually being quite damaging. And like the idea that kind of community work is like really powerful, like the Mexico example that you gave. But is there a way that, because it's such a global phenomenon and that we need to actually talk about it on a global level, because that's how you get structural changes across nations, is there like a way that you think, apart from something like the UN, which is very like symbolic rather than actually good at getting things done, potentially, like is there another way that it could better be done across like different platforms? So like things like the Mexican community, like the community of Muslims in Mexico are better acknowledged, or other indigenous communities are better acknowledged as well?
I think the thing is, when you have only a hammer, I mean, everything looks like a nail.
Yeah.
And in that sense, that is exactly the UN. I mean, if you read the declaration from which the United Nations came to be, you would have never thought that he could have like a panel on climate change. That was just out of the question. If you look at the UNHCR, it's talking about climate refugees now, but it was never something that it would have considered like 10 years ago. So in some sense, that's the only thing we have, so we have to kind of do something with it. But again, to kind of make it the only thing and not think about alternatives is really kind of just, you know, short-minded in some sense. And we definitely have to come up with I mean, the poetic way is kind of like top-down, bottom-up, kind of middle out and do everything at the same time and hopefully you'll get something. But in some sense, to say that the United Nations is something one should not partake in because it's an evil umbrella organization and all that. No, I'm not saying that's what you're saying. In some sense, that is what I'm saying. It's basically not mature enough because that is in some sense childish. It's like, oh, I'm not going to play with you because your games are not cool. I'm going to play with the people in the bottom and we're not going to make any change, but at least we're not the same. And that's how we roll, kind of thing. And yeah, so.
Yeah. Is there like a way that you, like, I don't know, like even just countries neighbouring each other, like you were talking about kind of like the Iraq and Turkey?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of them.
Like, yeah, there's a lot of countries that are like, so like polluting water and then downstream the countries get annoyed. Is there like a way that you think that there would ever be like a time where countries would feel able to feel like talk to each other about something like climate change or other issues?
Well, here's a suggestion. If two countries can sit on the table, talk about managing their boundary rivers, because that's something they actually share. Let's not talk about the area yet, but if they can do that, that would be amazing, because then you'd have kind of joint treaties on that. I mean, one of the most successful water treaties in the world, you'd be surprised to hear, is the Indus water treaty between India and Pakistan. I mean, if you read the news, you think there is no treaty, but that is the best functioning treaty we have, and in some sense we need more of that. And if countries can think of managing, I mean, in some sense, having your political borders, not necessarily resource borders. And there's a good example in Papua New Guinea. If you go there, the tribes, they have an understanding in which some places you cannot cross over with other tribes. Some places you can actually use for resources with other tribes. Some places you cannot fight with other tribes on, it's sacred ground. So it's a very fuzzy border. You cannot just draw a map and be like, these are these people, these are these people. They share different lands for different reasons. And if one person from this tribe sees the other in this place, they will be hostile, and in this other place they will be friendly. So if human beings can accommodate this diversity of feelings, why can nation states not? And there's really just, you know, that's a suggestion to think about. Whether that's feasible is a different story.
Okay, any more questions? Got a couple to end on, perhaps. With. I mean, the first one is that obviously the Liberation Theology series aims to be very practical. So bringing things back to Oxford, and you were saying that obviously this village in Mexico was achieving great things. I mean, what can we do in Oxford, do you think? In maybe university, but also town?
I think, well, there's no point to reinvent the wheel in that sense. There's a lot of people who are already doing a lot of things in Oxford. The Oxford Hub being one of them. So you can, on a personal level, you can get organic food, you can participate in like recycling food that is thrown away from supermarkets. They have like a communal soup every Saturday in which they kind of recycle food that's thrown away that is still not expired, and they can feed the homeless with that. So in some sense, joining the already existing forces is, to me, a perfectly fine solution. And on another kind of level, I mean, the university is also engaged in, you know, divestment, and whether that is effective, that is a different story, but basically taking up funds from fossil fuel industries and all of that. I don't see many people, just to restrict it, I don't see many people of faith in those circles. And that is just, why not? And to me, it's just not something happy to be, you know, to hear about. It's like, it should be everyone. And it almost seems as if, well, in the case of Muslims, there's this idea of, oh, this is not going to amount to much. This stops them from going there. And that is basically, it's the reverse feeling that should take you there. Is this, let's start there, see what comes out. Kind of. That's as far as I'm aware of in Oxford. There's also some university scheme for monitoring the energy use in buildings and how you can save. There's the student switch off campaign. There's many things that if you look at, you'd probably think, meh. But then again, that's where you meet people who probably will, you know, collaborate with down the line and start a nation state. A micronation in a village or a city state.
The second question I wanted to ask was, again, the ideal of liberation theology is kind of like, you know, shared readings and things. So can you let us in on maybe your sources for some of these
Yes,
sort of
very
things we should read?
important thing I forgot. Sayyid Hussein Nasr is a very key, I think, probably the only resource who spoke this about like as early as the 1950s, before it was cool. And he's got 2 books. One of them is Man and Nature. The other one is his PhD thesis, The Islamic Cosmological Doctrines. And another one to read is Llewellyn Vaughan Lee, book titled Spiritual Ecology. It's a collection of essays from faith leaders all over the planet talking about the issue of the environment being a crisis from within and what we can do about it. It's got people from Wendell Berry to the Dalai Lama. And a third book would be, that's a tough one, something practical. I guess The Green Dean is always a book that you should start from. I mean, it should be there on your shelf. It's I can't remember who the author was, but The Green Dean, Green and D-E-E-N, should 2010, I guess.
Ecology, something like that.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but that's a book to start with. So
I'll make sure these get posted on the event page.
there's another one from I forgot his name again, but it's called Islam and Ecology, and I think I've seen this in the Bodleian somewhere. So yeah, just track these down. There's not a lot of titles with these books with these kind of titles anyway.
Why did you choose the Islam and environment as a title of Let's Speak? Why did you choose Islam and ecology? Why didn't you choose?
Ecology is a very restricted, again, it's basically because I wanted to include everyone. And when you hear ecology, well, if you're from the field, you know exactly what it is. And if you're not, you think it's too niche, probably. So to me, the environment is just this word that you hear everywhere, and it doesn't really mean anything. Because you cannot live outside an environment, as far as I'm concerned. You can only exist within one. So it was just really an umbrella term to like kind of, well, bring about this audience, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you're happy, have you got any concluding remarks?
I don't have any, so I'll leave that to you.
Okay. Well, okay, before we all start making our way, I just want to, first of all, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I'm really happy and we brought together a lot of different voices. Just a reminder as well that this is the second in the series of 4 events on Islam and liberation. Third event to be confirmed, but the 4th event, I hope you've all put it in your diaries, 28th of November, Islam and decoloniality. I'll be definitely, because I do think, especially listening to what Hazim was saying about how we need to kind of create our own sort of political spaces in order to carry these things out. I do think decolonisation and decarbonisation do absolutely go together. I'm sorry, well, this is what happened to give me the last word. Thank you so much again for coming. Yeah, fine.
Oh, hey, sorry. For other things to do in Oxford, there's a group being set up now to try and recenter the voices of like people of colour and people of faith within kind of climate justice movements. And it's called Decolonising Decarbonise. So if you want to know more about it, like find us after or Facebook message me or anything. But we're hoping to have an event in 6 weeks. Which hopefully will be discussing various things going on around the world. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, and I'll make sure I get all the readings that Hazim suggested posted on the event page. But I was really amazed and impressed by the things you were saying, so let's make sure we show him our appreciation for his talk today. Yes, more.